And welcome to this panel discussion. I'm Kevin Gostola, managing editor of Shadowproof. This is Julian Assange's extradition trial and the war on journalism. And I'm joined here by my co-moderator and host, Juan Passarelli. Hey, Juan.
Hi, how's it going, Kevin?
And we wanted to get this group of journalists together. All of these people have spent the last 4 weeks following this extradition trial, which you've described and others have described as the trial of the century because of its importance. It certainly is that kind of an important trial as far as journalism. We've seen over the last 4 weeks how in the first week the prosecution stick to their talking point, which was that Julian Assange was not a journalist. And then after the first week, we saw a bit of a shift where now, and it was a dramatic shift actually, where now they were accepting that there were legitimate arguments that he would be protected by press freedom and laws that govern freedom of the press, but that they were going to say there's nothing that stands in the way of prosecuting a journalist. And that someone who is a journalist could commit crimes and they could be targeted by the US government. So Juan, as we get into this and we bring our panelists into the first hour, you're going to be leading the second hour. Is there anything you want to say up top about what it's been like to cover and follow this trial before we get into it?
I mean, for me, it's been the most surreal and almost the most emotional month of the last 10 years that I've been covering the WikiLeaks story. I've been filming the WikiLeaks people since the Iraq war logs, and I've seen the history being made in the process. I've seen the inside workings of WikiLeaks all the. But basically, I saw the entire case that was presented today throughout the last 10 years, and what I saw in court was like a surreal, nightmare. I was comparing it to Fear and Loathing Las Vegas, when Johnny Depp goes into the to that bar and there's crocodiles and monsters. That's how it felt. It didn't feel like justice at all. The UK has a proud reputation of upholding the rule of law and human rights. And what I saw in this court was, coming from Guatemala, I would say even worse than the most politicized and criminal cases that I've seen in my own country. So it's a great embarrassment for the Crown Prosecution Service and British justice, what has taken place in the last 4 weeks.
Yeah, and I also think one thing that we are likely to get into is the kind of denial by the US government, the misrepresentations about how Julian Assange would be treated if he's brought to the United States, the constant claim that he wouldn't be like a national security defendant, or let's shorten it, that he would not be treated like a terrorist in the way that he would be confined pre-trial and after his trial if he was convicted, the denial about how they would try to make sure he can't spread classified information. But let's not waste any more time. Let's bring in the panelists that we have for our first hour. I'll be leading this part of the conversation. So Mohammed El-Mwazi, you're with Sputnik. Thank you for joining this discussion. We also have Tarek Haddad, who is in London, an independent reporter. Thanks for joining us, Tarek. And then we have Mary Kostakidis, who's in Australia. Thanks for joining us, Mary. And we have Kathy Vogan, who is a Consortium News executive producer. Thank you for joining the panel. So
just before we go, because I think I have all of our other guests here, I just want to introduce the panel for the second half, which is Taylor Hudak, who is with us. Then Richard Medhurst, I think he's around. Yes, he's there.
Yeah. Hi.
And Joe Laurie, who's still who's going to take Kathy's place later on. We will turn our cameras off and our microphones off, and we will join you on the second hour. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Juan. So to begin, I'm going to go ahead and start with Mary and just ask you, I know that you've recognized the stakes and also recognized the stakes for the world globally in Australia and other countries if this case is able to succeed. Why don't you start us off by talking about the importance of following and covering this case and, what you found to be some of the more significant developments when it comes to the dangers that are posed by the U.S. government bringing this prosecution. I think you might be muted, Mary.
There you go. Thank you. Yes, it's the most important press freedom case since the Pentagon Papers, of course, and it's a huge significance for journalists all over the world. It's a huge significance for citizens all over the world because of the consequences for democracy. But what we're seeing really is the rise of authoritarianism in Australia as well. And probably in the UK as well, and certainly in the US. So they're using laws in Australia to start prosecuting journalists here and whistleblowers. I think what's not recognised, though, unfortunately, by enough journalists, is that Assange is the canary in the mine, and there still isn't a significant number of mainstream journalists getting it. And I was hoping that in February, when the magistrate clarified that if you put the intrusion charge aside, obtaining, receiving, publishing was still going to be a crime, that they would realise this is about all of us. Not so. And as you alluded to earlier, Kevin, during the last 3 weeks of this trial, the prosecutor said numerous times, the US has never said it won't prosecute journalists. And that's a worry. I mean, it's loud and clear. They're sending a message loud and clear. And then if the trouble is, though, the US has always thought of itself as being exceptional. So they can do this, but no one else is allowed to do it. And if you try and prosecute an American citizen, then as we saw with the El Masri case, what they do is they just put pressure on the country to not go ahead with it. So it's a huge problem, and Australia is really a sub-imperial state. The US says jump and we say how high. And I think the UK as well. So this is an obstacle, if you like, to our country standing up for Julian. If only the public could have watched the last 4 weeks, I think in the court of public opinion, who would have said this person deserves to end up in a steel shoebox for the rest of his life for what he's done? I just can't see anyone supporting that. But unfortunately, the public haven't seen it. We few have been very privileged to, and through us, I hope, there have been people that have seen it through our eyes and through our words. I'm concerned about the three issues on which I'm conscious I don't want to talk too long because other people need to speak as well. But there are three things that the judge is going to consider in coming to a decision. So despite all those wonderful, really strong witnesses, and the defence team did a terrific job, it's whether it's going to be a political, whether she finds that it's politically motivated, the surveillance, which, would be a reason to deny the extradition because they've broken the law, and then his health and what he's likely to face there, cruel and inhumane treatment. With respect to the political nature of the trial. I don't, the extradition, they really focused on something quite narrow, didn't they? They focused on party political. So they've put all their eggs in that basket. They didn't look at it from a broader point of view, as in, you know, political sides. So how can you argue that espionage, national security are not political issues?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't hear that argument at all, really. So anyway, maybe I should stop there and let you go to others as well.
Well, I think those are great opening remarks, Mary. So I'm going to bring Mohammed in, and I want to say before we get too far along that if anybody didn't hear, the announcement is expected on the decision by the judge on January 4th in 2021. And so, you know, Mohammed, you were there, you were outside the court, you were inside the court, you're dealing with this Old Bailey Courthouse and its conditions for people who want to cover the proceedings. You know, what to you stood out as you were following these proceedings over the last 4 weeks?
Thank you very much, Kevin. So just to address one point that was raised by Mary, that the issue of the political nature of espionage was raised in February. So it's, people should remember or be aware, for those who aren't aware, that the substantive extradition hearings are split into two parts. So the second part with all the witness arguments was over the last 4 weeks, but in February we had a week where legal arguments were, substantive legal arguments were also made, including that address, but it was many months ago. It'll be in the representations as well. So I followed the hearing about 10 minutes from the court via secure video link for the vast majority of the time. And then the final week, I was able to start getting in. Tarek was helpful with that as well. So thank you, Tarek, putting me in touch with somebody who could get my name onto the list. It's a almost surreal experience. I mean, you have people from a range of backgrounds who I have to tip my hat to their dedication, being based outside the court, whether it was sunny, whether it's windy, whether it's freezing cold and raining, who to the point of, I'm sure, the consternation of many of the people actually inside the courthouse, including the security, were consistently out there with signs, handing out leaflets, explaining the nature of the case, holding up signs saying honk if you support Julian Assange, or honk to free Assange. And actually, the number of times that vans, trucks, buses, motorcycles passed by these streets and did end up honking, or people did end up holding up their fists, was quite substantial. There wasn't a single day where that didn't happen. Getting inside was, I have to say, you were there, Kevin, at Belmarsh for the first part, for part one of the hearings, and you saw the nature, let's say the disorganized nature of things, of hearing the case there. I would say that many of, not the same problems, different problems, but nonetheless problems of access replicated themselves, which I have to say, even I was surprised, because the Old Bailey is a criminal court that has been around for a very long time, that is used to hearing high-profile cases with large amounts of media and public interest in them. And the situation where you had to apply well in advance to get your name onto a list, and then if you're standing outside to queue up to get into the court, there's someone standing there with a list of names, and then they'll say, why are you coming in? And if you say you're coming in to hear the Assange hearing, they'll say, well, you're not on the list, so you can't come in. Even though, as one security guard later said, and as the court clerk told me, repeated to me, if you have a press card, that means you have access to the court building, right? The list is just about getting into the press annex inside the court for that particular hearing. So, and I remember having this argument with one of the security who didn't see my name on the list because she had an old list that was printed out. So there's that thing happening as well. And I was having to say, look, even if, forget about this case, I'm allowed to come into this building. It's a public building. I have a press card that, you know, and she's saying, well, I'm just doing what I was told. So people can imagine the kinds of difficulties that people had getting access. But I have to tip my hat, like I said, to the people who who stayed and persevered outside. And I'll just end on this. There were activists who came in at 7 in the morning to queue up for the public entrance, which is on the side of the court building, so it's still outside, and gave up their spots for people who, for example, NGO monitors, such as Rebecca Vincent from Reporters Without Borders, or other people who wanted to be able to get access but couldn't get access because there's only a handful of people that were allowed into the press gallery, all made substantially worse by COVID and social distancing requirements linked to that. So that's just a brief overview.
Well, thank you for that, Mohammed. I'd like to bring in Kathy, who's in the command center for Consortium News, and to ask you what your thoughts were. You were following this virtually. You had access to the courtroom feed, much like me. You were taking in all of the technical difficulties that were had, but you were also following the more substantive issues in the proceedings. And this was quite a crucial trial. We were the eyes and ears for the public. What was it like to follow this for the past month?
Well, maybe the sound of it was the most difficult, certain people's voices, but I won't elaborate on they know who they are. I just, of course, I was listening to Joe's roundup every night. I was live tweeting it. Joe was telling the story of each day, so it was going far.
We sleep, we dream, with no time in between. We never stop, whistling our just gleam. From north and south, we come from east and west, breathing as one, living in faith or dying in flame. We love, our mission is blessed. We fight for you, for freedom unforeseen. Thinking as one, rolling along to the beat of the drum. We march the Black Cross machine.
Hey everyone, we apologize for the technical difficulties, but we're glad to have you back. I think we cut out in the middle of Mohammed, but I'm going to bring in the other two panelists that we have, and we'll come back and catch the rest of what Mohammed had to say and then get more of his insights. So Kathy is joining us from the command center of Consortium News, and I want to hear from you, Kathy. What kind of thoughts, views you have about following this month of this trial?
Well, of course, there's a few things that really leap out at me among all of the information that we were dealing with and writing live tweets and all that, doing presentations. Joe and I had a lot of discussions as well of, oh, that's really strange. And there are a few things that really leapt out at me, and maybe they're not sort of the most obvious ones. So because I'm a slightly technical person, I paid particular attention to Professor Grothoff and Mr. Eller I think he's a professor too. Yes, certainly he's a forensic examiner, and he's worked a lot for the government. So what comes out first, and this is actually from Eller, is that there is a total lack of forensic evidence for the first count. And so that really is trying to hang around the chat log extract from someone called Nobody, which Manning has agreed is her. But then there's this other character called Nathaniel Frank, and Eller was asked if he was, if he was asked to investigate. I'm getting myself back there. Yeah, so Eller was asked if there was any evidence that, who was on the other end? Who was this Nathaniel Frank? And he said, no, there's no indication whatsoever. And I remember thinking that about 8 years ago, when I saw that emerge at the end of Manning's trial. I thought, oh, this is a bit dodgy, asking for any good with cracking hash passwords. We've got rainbow tables for that. But who was Manning talking to? There was, I think it was, yes, Mr. Fitzgerald asked Eller, why did you use Assange in your report? Why did you use Assange's name and Nathaniel Frank's interchangeably? And he suddenly said, yeah, of course, I have no reason for doing that. My apologies. It was just something that everybody sort of assumed. So that lack of forensic evidence lies there at the base, and it's very important for this Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charge, because if you can't prove who Manning was talking to, then you can't charge that person. But the other thing is that the password itself, there was no indication in the chat of context, what it was to be used for. Was it for a government computer? If it was to be used at all. So this is really, really too thin in terms of the forensics to be able to go much further with that side of the case. The other thing that leapt out at me was selective prosecution, what I would call selective prosecution. So we have been talking a lot about the mainstream media partners who published all of those files, the Afghan war logs and Iraq war logs. Of course, that was the first period where everything was methodically redacted, but in fact, it seems like the charges about naming informants are related to the unredacted cables. This is the impression that I've got from where the prosecution have been driving it. It's the names that went out, and of course, popular sites in the world. So, I was thinking, well, are WikiLeaks the Goldilocks zone? You don't go after mainstream journalists because maybe they're going to do what they're told. Their jobs depend on it. So, in fact, why now there's another level of why WikiLeaks was selected for prosecution and specifically pulling the editor-in-chief out of it. So that was the second thing. The third thing was, of course, abuse of power. And the most significant fact that I took was delivered by the witness Maureen Baird. And that is that the CIA, or the intelligence agency, the intelligence community, I should say, do weigh in on whether a prisoner, an inmate, gets SAMs, is subjected to SAMs. So, this whole problem, it's possibly exactly the same client that can put Julian away in a black hole forever. This is where the Chinese wall can go up, but I mean, it really is a very, very serious problem.
All right. Thanks for all those comments, Kathy. I think those were good comments on the, especially related to the password cracking allegations that have been leveled against Assange. So let's get Tarek in here. And also, obviously, because of the hiccup, I don't think Juan will be upset if we go about 5 minutes over our allotted time and squeeze in a little more commentary here. So, so Tarek, let me insert an issue in here, and maybe you'll tackle it within some of your more general comments related to what we've been hearing. But you and I, we both have been paying attention to this testimony that was entered into evidence on the last day of the evidentiary portion of the extradition trial, which relates to the legally privileged materials that were essentially seized by the FBI in the United Kingdom through the Ecuador government taking this and then passing it on to the FBI. I think that's an incredibly crucial issue. In the second hour, Juan and the panelists are going to go into a lot of detail into UC Global and that operation, but this kind of runs parallel and in support of all of that espionage activity against Assange that took place prior to his arrest.
Yeah, first of all, just thanks for having me on, and it's a pleasure to be with you guys and kind of speak to some of you for the first time. Just from my perspective, and I think kind of, there's been so much in these hearings, and I think we've just had our own technical issues, and we were talking about technical issues before, a slight irony, but I think that's the interesting thing, is that actually, there's many different perspectives to this story, and actually being sort of, as Mo said before, being in the courtroom for the last week, I had my own technical difficulties for the first 2.5 weeks, and I essentially just said, no, I'm going to get inside the courtroom. I want to be there, essentially, because I knew that the live feed of the video, even though they have you have to remember that there's many different technical things that have to come together for. It's not just we know that it's easy for the journalists to complain that we're not getting access, but the court also has to worry about every single person that's giving testimony. And to be frank about it, for them, that's their #1 priority. For District Judge Vanessa Barreza, of course, this is the thing, that's very easy to think that this is a kangaroo court, and I understand all those sentiments. But to be fair to the court staff and to District Judge Barreza, she specifically went out of her way to arrange for these hearings to be at the Old Bailey, because it has the best media team out of what's available. We have to remember that the legal system moves at a much slower pace, and we're all delving in deep into WikiLeaks. We know these technical issues. We know about rainbow tables and passwords and using Zoom conferences and all that kind of thing. The courts are just sort of several years behind. These video platforming services weren't even used in any proceedings 6 months ago. Not just Assange, for any, you had it sort of in not in criminal proceedings, but like civil proceedings and family court. They started using things like Skype slowly, because obviously you're talking about families being split up, or different sorts of issues. And then with the outbreak of coronavirus, there was obviously a massive backlog onto the courts, which thankfully, there's already kind of these talks about how to, that's some little things that people might not kind of get, but there'd already been in sort of talks before coronavirus of how do we move the justice system online and things like that. Sort of small initiatives that no one really pays attention to, but then coronavirus sort of comes along, and then every court across the UK is sort of dealing with a lot of backlog issues. And to be fair to the Central Criminal Court staff and the people that we've been dealing with, I think they've done a pretty good job. Obviously we've had different issues certain days, but hopefully everyone managed to get those resolved and managed to get enough of the hearings for them to kind of pick out the bits that were interesting to them. And I think the other thing that's been really great to see is that, I mean, Kevin, you had issues on a particular day, and then people helped you out. Mohammed, there was a lot of solidarity of people helping each other out, and there's a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes. If a certain witness statement wasn't being able to, someone couldn't get their hands on it, I could speak to this person who could give it to me. And, there's a lot of helping each other out. And, we say a lot that there's not been media coverage, but actually I've been sort of analyzing it for some newsletters and things like that I'm helping prepare and arrange. And actually, if you kind of look day by day, there's actually been a lot of coverage from people like the Press Association, AP, even the Guardian have, done, we all kind of, it's very easy for us to kind of hate on the Guardian, and of course they deserve, their to have that kind of that story told in a very public light about those passwords and how, you know, they were essentially the ones responsible for, you know, much of the kind of damage that, or, you know, the repercussions that led to, you know, what is putting Julian in the situation that he currently is. But, you know, things change, and they do have, they have done some reports, and there's been a lot of good media coverage. And yeah, that's actually one of the articles I was referring to. I think there was one yesterday as well that was, you know, good. Obviously, you know, they even talked about the issue about crypto was the one to publish first, but they sort of kind of omitted the relevant bits about their situation. But if you kind of look at the overall picture, you know, we had articles from Reuters and all sorts of places. So, you know, you look at AP Pictures and Getty and roughly sort of kind of professional wire services that are going out to newsrooms across the whole world. You know, there's editors across the world who will have, you know, access to that information. And you know, I'm publishing things like the witness statements online. There's people like challengepower.info, which is also a really amazing resource for people. You know, they're going to be publishing the statements, and they're publishing their own pieces, and they're also kind of collating the media coverage. So there's, you know, it's all there. And I think with these specific 4 weeks that we've just had, it's obviously, like Juan said, and so many people, these are the most crucial 4 weeks that we've had, because it's the evidentiary part of the hearings. So, for example, like, and I'm really happy to hear that the kind of different people, the things that different people have picked up on. But yes, to go back to what you mentioned, Kevin, about on the last day we had these witness statements. You know, I think you know, Gareth Pearce, who's the kind of lead solicitor for Julian Assange, had, I think, at least seven witness statements that she'd written, possibly more. But you know, and so we had one that was not sort of accepted as evidence, but we have to remember 6 that now have been accepted, and you know, they've been signed off by not only they've been signed off by the Crown Prosecution Service. So it's like, sort of behind the scenes, we also have to remember that between the legal teams, between the prosecution and the defense, they're talking behind closed doors about what documents can be submitted and what can't. So if we look at some of Gareth Pearce's latest statements, for example, statement number 2 is, I mean, if you just, I'm going to make this available to everyone very soon, but everyone should read witness statement number 2. It's just a treasure trove of information. It's literally, I was reading it last night, and I read all of her statements yesterday, and I mean, first of all, you just have to tip your hat off to her. She's kind of a solicitor that's been around for decades, and is, you know, it's maybe a bad comparison, but she's someone that I would view in the UK as someone that's equivalent to RBG. You know, she's a, you know, human rights lawyer that's been around for decades. That's represented some major cases. You know, truly a professional solicitor, and the things that she's documenting as evidence that has been accepted are, you know, truly remarkable. And obviously, it goes into the UC Global and the seizure of Julian Assange's personal files and his legal documents. I think, from what I understand, there's volumes and volumes and volumes of stuff that have been taken in this sort of 1 week period where, you know, essentially, you know, this sort of operation was put together, and we have now sort of, there's evidence that supports these things, that journalists that, you know, want to go and look into these issues, there's lots of little bits that they can go read that statement, and you can pick up one paragraph of that statement, and that is like, you could write a 3,000 word investigative piece on just one paragraph of, you know, Gareth Pearce's statement. It's that rich with information. It's really a remarkable document. Just that second one, but all 7 are, or I believe 6. We have access to 6. Sorry, but you know, they are. And this is the thing: when District Judge Baritza is now going to be making her decision, that will be something as a point of record that's there, and it can be referred to in future proceedings if it goes to the High Court, the European Court human rights. That is there as a piece of evidence from this solicitor who has represented Julian Assange for years and years. And we've also got statements from Jennifer Robinson, who's also, an excellent lawyer that's represented Julian for a long time. And, many, many different witness statements that have these sort of elements of the story that they're now on the record officially. And now it's up to us as journalists to write those stories and do that coverage and discuss it.
So I'd like to get Mary back in here and ask you, since you have met Julian Assange, and we also saw, on display the toll that this is taking on a family who is going through this prosecution, and we've heard from Stella Morris outside the court on that closing day as she articulates what's happening to Julian Assange. I think that people who are following this broadcast might appreciate you, sharing some of your insights and experience in being able to meet with Julian, and then to understand what this means for him and everyone involved as they go through this prosecution, and to also recognize that there is a human that's at the center of this, and that we're not just talking in the abstract about a publisher, we're not just talking about legal issues, but that there are things very real here that are going to impact a family. You're still muted. You gotta unmute, Mary.
Yes. So, look, unlike a lot of the stories you hear about Julian, or comments you hear about Julian in the press, I'm one of those people that really like him, and admire him, admire his courage, his principles, his ideals. He's trying to change the world.
Looks like we might be having a little bit of an issue with your audio, Mary. I'm not quite sure. It seems to have been lost. So I'm gonna move on to Mohammed, and then we'll come back to you. It was an important question that we asked. Mohammed, when you were following this, every day you're listening to these snippets and you're trying to pull out these different things that need to be headlines that people can grab onto. I think one of your strengths of your reporting is picking up on these quotes and finding them and making them the centerpieces of your articles for that particular day. And so I'm hoping that maybe you could share a couple of the ones that, as you sit here during our conversation today, you think back, you go, oh, like those moments, that wasn't just a highlight. That's something that a year from now is still going to have implications for press freedom.
Thanks, Kevin. And actually, I was looking forward to hear Mary describe her understanding of Julian, knowing him personally. So I hope we'll be able to hear that soon. You're right in that each day I'm trying to figure out what will be the headline, and the frustrating part is thinking, as I get more exhausted by the end of the day, I don't want to just phone it in, right? So it's like, it's not just any quote. It's got to be a quote that's relevant and significant. But it's sometimes something is said that works perfectly, and I know I'm like, that will be the quote. And then other times I only really know what the headline will be once I get to the end. Lots of people may not realize that, generally speaking, authors don't get to decide their headlines from most outlets. I'm fortunate in that in most of my cases, the headlines that I choose are the ones that remain. Not 100%, but most of my cases. So some of the examples, key examples would be Trump approved of pardon offer to Assange in exchange for source of DNC leaks. I thought that was significant. I had convinced myself that they were okay. Ex-prison warden tells Assange.
Oh, sorry, we're hearing Mary's audio now. I think it's working, but we'll let you finish, Mohammed, after she's. Mary, your audio appears to be working, but I'm gonna let Mohammed finish his answer, and then we'll come back to you. Okay? Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to step on that, Mohammed.
Oh no, that's all right. That's all right. Assange's removal from embassy was coordinated on, quote, direct orders from the U.S. president, end quote, court is told. That comes from Cassandra Fairback's statement that was read. And of course, the prosecution worked very hard to ensure that they could agree to a statement with the defense, because if both parties agree to a statement, then the judge says, well, that means there's going to be no cross-examination, so therefore there's no need for the live testimony, right? That's one of the key reasons why the two parties agreeing to statements was necessary. One of the final headlines of the 4 weeks was, Assange's lawyers were, quote, priority targets, end quote, of US-backed espionage of Ecuadorian embassy. And then a couple others. I mean, that sounds pretty obvious, right? That means the surveillance of the UC Global that were hired to protect Julian Assange and the embassy was and ultimately targeted towards surveilling them, including the lawyers, as Tariq Haddad had mentioned. Assange faces conditions, quote, essentially the same as solitary confinement, end quote, in the US, the Old Bailey's told. And then finally, here's one which I thought was important, and there were a few headlines in relation to this because there's a few days worth of testimony. Witness rejects prosecutor's assertion that Assange had, quote, a cavalier attitude to protecting informants, because that was an exact quote that James Lewis put to one of the witnesses. So I put it to you that Mr. Assange had a cavalier attitude, and which is interesting considering the fact that we had already like 3 days worth of testimony from investigative journalists who worked in the so-called bunker with WikiLeaks, talking about the meticulous redaction process that they went through over a 9-month period before the Guardian journalists accidentally published the full passphrase to the unredacted cables as the title of a chapter of their book. That was how they accidentally, quote unquote, did it. So that's fine. So I think those are some of the key things, because those all relate to key legal arguments being presented against the indictment, as it were.
So let's go back to Mary, and I want to let her finish giving us her recollections and her views on being able to meet and work with Julian.
Okay, but just before I do that, can I just say, Kevin, that there's a question that's come through from one of our Twitter friends about what might happen to Julian if Baraitser decides in his favor. Will the US, can they appeal? I think the answer is they can. Yeah. And will he have to stay in jail until the appeal is heard? But I'll let someone else answer that. I'll just, it's been a really long battle. It's been long and exhausting 10 years for Julian. He's paid an enormous price. With Sweden behaving in the most appalling way, and the UK really egging them on and saying, don't you dare, not just egging them on, don't you dare pull out now. So all the Swedish stuff, and then it takes a very special person, I think, to be able to stay indoors in the one place for 7 years and to continue working. He's had a fantastic team, of course, around him, and that's been a huge factor. But you also have to be a very special person, and he is a very special person. So I engaged with it very early on because of the importance of what he was doing, the fact that you had this anonymous way for whistleblowers to hand on information. That was that innovation was extraordinary. So he was leading the frontier, at the frontier of the digital world. And that all came out of the community that he was part of in Melbourne as a young man. So when the whole thing started to get terribly dangerous for him, I engaged with it more and got to know his parents, his mother, travelled with her to Canberra, travelled with her to various universities around the country, where we held, with other activists, held discussions so that people could engage with the issue. and also visited Julian on several occasions, the last time in Belmarsh. But, you know, it was actually good to hear someone talking about Asperger's, you know, openly, because he is one of those people that are highly intelligent, extremely focused, you know, to the exclusion of everything else almost. And that's why he's been able to survive, I think. But the point is that everyone has a breaking point, that he's human. And the fact that he can continue to be strong and focus on this case doesn't mean that if they decide in, you know, favor of extradition, and certainly if he, you know, survives long enough to head over there, that he's going to be the same Julian. And we need to make sure, we need to stop it, you know. We need to make sure that the Julian that he is can stay intact. It's very, very important for all of us. And we're very, very fortunate to have him. When I hear Greta Thunberg talking about herself as being different, and people have a dig at her, I'm sure, you know, her schoolmates and also journalists and politicians, you know, like to have a go at her because she's unusual. Well, the reason they're having a go at her is because they don't like the message. But the fact is, she is unusual, and Julian's, you know, similar. And that and it's people like that that have enormous courage. So it's for me, it was very moving to be able to see him, which is why I wanted them to cut away more to the defendant and ask them to please do that, because if we don't see him, all we get is occasionally, well, I think twice we heard his voice and the judge putting him in his box. But it was really important for me to see him interacting with his lawyers, to see him interacting with Stella. Yeah, those precious moments where he was interacting with Stella. You know, moments that all of us live all the time. They're so rare for him. And it was very gratifying to see. Even though they were very brief, of course. So yeah, so I'm hoping that she's going to do the right thing. I'm hoping she's not going to look for an excuse to extradite him, because there's plenty there. There's plenty of ammunition there to stop her. That's what I'm hoping.
Oh, thanks for that, Mary. So we've got about 10, maybe 15 minutes, given the technical issues that we had. This may run a little over the 2 hours, and I have to hand this panel over to Juan, but I want to give everyone a chance to get in as we start closing. I think what I'd like to just say here is that I've seen the breakdown of the defense's case really being into these several crucial areas. We've alluded and talked about the abuses of process, the abuses of power on the part of the United States, the way that they've made this entire process entirely unfair. Mary was just alluding to some of the mental health evidence that was put on the record that could potentially help save him. We know that there's the prior cases of Lori Love and Gary McKinnon, in which that factored into the decision by the UK government to reject those extradition requests that were brought forward by the United States. There's also the publications, which we heard a lot of evidence about, but unfortunately, if Julian Assange is put on trial in the United States, it would be very nearly impossible to raise any of this evidence. So I think, if you're willing to, I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes going around and hearing from you about the publication evidence and also the content, and the fact that torture and war crimes by the United States was essentially a focus of this extradition trial in a way that it could never be if Julian Assange was brought to trial in the United States under the espionage. And we know this because of how President Barack Obama's administration went after whistleblowers aggressively. And in fact, Chelsea Manning was only able to bring this kind of evidence to the courtroom because she pled guilty to some offenses. So I'll start with Kathy. We'll go to Tarek. We'll go to Mohammed. We'll end with Mary. And if you have some of your thoughts, I'd say take a couple minutes, each of you, and walk us through some of the publication evidence as we wrap up this discussion.
Okay, well, before I make any comment on specific elements, I think it's worth remembering, and maybe some people don't if they're recent supporters of Julian and WikiLeaks, but you know, when I first met Mary, this is 9 years ago, Julian was getting the Sydney Peace Prize. Julian was getting awarded by, he was getting a Walkley, which is the equivalent of a Pulitzer Prize, for the same material that he is being prosecuted for now. And, you know, 10 years has gone by. But I mean, what that must do to your mind to be, to have so many awards. You know, I think he's had, he and WikiLeaks have had about 20 awards, including from Amnesty International. And then this is just so, you know, the opportunity came around after 9 years of utter smear and misinformation. But I think for me, what's most important that's come out in the evidence is there are terrible stories, I know, about El-Masri, about what happened to him, the kind of torture that Craig Murray has revealed as well in that black site in Uzbekistan. But what is really frightening is the pressure put on countries not to prosecute. It's not just Germany, it's Italy as well. That came out in Stefano Marizzi's statement, that the Berlusconi government were pressured not to go after the CIA. And it seems to me you've got, you know, at least one truant that runs all the way through this, right to the point of being able to seal his fate under special administrative measures and never being able to see or speak to anyone again, after being a world hero and for the same material, winning the most awards, I think, that any journalist has ever won.
Thank you for that. So Tarek, you have to unmute yourself.
Excuse me, sorry. Just Kathy, that was really great to hear, and I think I share a lot of that perspective. And yeah, I think for me personally, it was, I mean, what was most interesting is it started off as hearings against Julian Assange, and then sort of day by day, we're watching every day, we're writing news stories, and sort of halfway into the third week, it felt I kind of had the realization that it's very quickly not Julian Assange that's kind of in the midst of these hearings. It became a sort of, it's the United States government, and it was all the evidence that we've been hearing day after day was becoming sort of a political embarrassment for the United Kingdom. And there was actually some very interesting sort of dialogues, you know, I can't remember exactly specific relating to what, but you know, there was a point of law that kind of came up about one of the statements, and the prosecutor on behalf of the US government, James Lewis QC, you know, had to kind of just say, you know, he was essentially backed into a corner, and he was kind of speechless for a few minutes, which is actually very rare to see him sort of not knowing what to do in a specific situation. And he kind of, after a while, he was just, we're going to have to kind of consult the US government on this, because he really didn't know for once, actually. I'm sorry that I can't be a bit more specific about this, but I'll maybe hopefully try and write about it soon. But there's so many different little bits of, you know, little key key moments in the court where it's, it shifted, and, I meet a lot of the activists, and like Mo said, they've done an absolutely amazing job outside of court every day. But I do get this impression that from outside of court that there is sort of this feeling that Baraitser is this kind of iron-fisted ruler who's, is completely impartial, and she's just a puppet of the US government, and she's just going to do it. But, I think we have to be fair to her. She's obviously, she's got to her position through hard work. She's a solicitor. Well, I don't know actually, but she would have been trained as a lawyer in the United Kingdom. She got to that position. She's shown on several occasions that she can be fair. And just to speak of those sort of key moments, obviously, it made mainstream media headlines when Julian sort of interrupted the court during the middle of the defense. And it was sort of, Baraitser tells Julian Assange to shut up or she'll kick him out, that kind of mentality. But actually, there were other instances where Julian interrupted the court, and actually Baraitser was kind of respectful of what Julian had to say. And, it also, to kind of speak to what Mary had to say, it showed you that, because I was there for the last week, actually sitting in the main courtroom, kind of watching him, everything, trying to get everything as much as I can with shorthand, because I have court reporting experience. I was, okay, I'm having issues with technical problems. I want to be there in the courtroom, watching him every day, trying to see every interaction with every lawyer, trying to get it all down as much as possible. I mean, I've got, I think, about 10 notebooks that are filled with just scribbles, essentially, but some of it might never see the light of day. But there's so many things like that I think several people have sort of talked about these things, but I don't want to sort of talk for too long. I could probably ramble about this case for hours and hours, but there's lots of key turning points in this case that there's things for us to, as journalists, to kind of say, it's not a closed deal, and it's up to us to document them. And I think several people have said that they'd like to maybe write books on the subject, and I encourage everyone to do it. Everyone will have their own pieces of evidence that they picked up and their own experiences of this that relate to this story.
So thank you, Tarek. We got like 5 to 10 minutes here, and we need to start wrapping up. So Mohammed, your thoughts on the publication evidence? Anything else you want to add as we begin to conclude here?
One thing I think is worth people thinking about, this came from Clive Stafford Smith, who was, I think, the very first person to testify in public. He's a very long-time human rights lawyer, US-based for most of his career, although now he's currently in the UK. He founded Reprieve. And I interviewed him outside of court when he was done testifying, but he did mention this in court as well, that one example of crucial information that was brought forward by WikiLeaks was in the cables, including cables which are part of the indictment against him, which showed that the then Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani had said to the American ambassador, Ann Patterson, that, quote, "It's not a big deal if you murder our citizens with drones. We'll complain in the National Assembly and then we'll ignore it." So, he told me that this is a situation he was very deeply involved in, Clive Stafford Smith, because they were representing family members of people killed in US drone strikes in Waziristan. He described people being killed. And this is, once again, he pointed out, Pakistan is one of the allies of the United States, but in the name of the war on terror in Waziristan, and based on intelligence that he described as being, quote, fantastically bad, they were murdering children left, right, and center. That's something he pointed to me. And this is something that helped to bring that into context with the diplomatic cables, that what many people may have suspected, but then you had proof of the Prime Minister saying to the American ambassador that it's okay, that any of my complaints are just for show. But it also assisted with the civil litigation being brought on behalf of these families. So that's something I didn't expect to hear from in the court, and I'm glad I did, because I wasn't even aware that that particular conversation had been revealed within the diplomatic cables.
Thank you for that. And so, Mary, we'll go to you for a few minutes, and anything you want to say about how the publications themselves factored into the trial as we move on to the next hour.
Well, there's a lot that could be said about the publications and publications that didn't factor into the trial, right from material that led to the Arab Spring. But the problem is that public interest is no defense. And this is the issue. That's why you can't, the fact that they're prosecuting a journalist and a publisher under the Espionage Act means that all the good that's come of all the publications is irrelevant. That's the absurdity. That's the absurdity. When you look at this, the groups that have benefited, they tend to be people who are vulnerable groups in society, Indigenous people whose environment has been trashed by corporations, whose the populations have been killed because of the poisoning of their environment. They have won court cases because of WikiLeaks documents. All of that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And that's why this case is political. And that's why, if no matter what Baraitser does, I just I'm hoping that Boris might do something in the end. I don't know, but don't forget that question. If anyone can answer it, I'll let you wrap up, Kevin. But just this issue of what does he have to? Would he have to stay in jail if she finds in his favour?
Yeah. So I think that that might be something the next group of people could tackle further. My thought is that when you get to a new court, you have another opportunity to apply for bail. But that's just based on my layman's understanding of how the US court system works. I don't know what would be different about the UK system. Maybe somebody is better equipped to answer that. But like you say, it's a big deal that all this material is coming out, and there's a chance that it may not be able to play any role in saving Julian Assange from being extradited, even though we have all this evidence of the good it has done. And even though you can see brazenly the political nature of this prosecution, as this Trump administration, with Mike Pompeo really leading it, going after the International Criminal Court and sanctioning people who are trying to investigate war crimes and torture. And we heard how WikiLeaks publications are being used by people who are trying to get some modicum, some small amount of justice for what they've survived. And Dan Ellsberg, I think, put it really well. I'll invoke him as I hand this over to Juan. Dan Ellsberg said, with all this testimony we're hearing from, not testimony, all these pronouncements we're hearing from the prosecution about how much they care for informants and human sources that were made vulnerable, this US government hasn't cared about these people. There have been untold numbers of civilian deaths, 35, 37 million people displaced from this region. And yet you want us to believe that you care about the people who are suffering. It's just hard to fathom. So that's it for me. I appreciated being able to moderate and lead this discussion with our first group of panelists. All of these journalists have been doing extremely wonderful work, and we'll be sharing links to their work so that you can continue to follow what they're doing. Their coverage on Assange has been unparalleled, and by comparison, we have another group of journalists that have done tremendous work. So I hand this over to Juan Passarelli, my co-moderator, who is going to lead everyone through this second hour.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm so happy that you guys ended on this subject of the publications and the public interest and the Espionage Act, because that's how I wanted to start this one. I wanted to go back to 2009 and 2010 when people thought that the Afghan war was being won. People thought that the Iraq war was over. And throughout the WikiLeaks publications, we found out through the Afghan war logs that not only was the war not being won, it was a total and complete disaster. We found out that the Iraq war, and going a little bit then into the Afghan war, there was also death squads, as you see in Latin American dictatorships, targeted assassinations through of people that the intelligence that brought us the weapons of mass destruction deemed people that deserve to die. And then we go to the Iraq war logs and the cables. And I want just to point out one cable in particular that really churns my stomach, and that had so much impact in this world because it helped bring, if not an end to the Iraq war, de-escalation of the war. And this is a cable that describes a coalition force group going into a farmer's house, and he and his extended family, I think it was 11 people in total, were handcuffed. There was about 5 to 7 children, I can't remember the exact name, and they were executed in cold blood, like the Nazis used to do. And then they ordered a warplane to come and missile the place down and to erase the evidence. And this actually helped the prime minister at the time, the Iraqi prime minister, to remove the immunity of the US soldiers, and that brought about a huge removal of the US Army. Not complete, because they're still there, but there was a de-escalation in the amount of invasion, shall we say, that the United States had in Iraq. And as I start this panel, I think I want to start with the importance of this material and the Espionage Act being brought about, and the consequences that this could have on all journalists in the world, the extraterritoriality of it, and just what it could do to journalism. So I think that I want to start maybe with Joe, who has just joined us, and I'd like to hear your views on that.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Yeah, I went into this 4-week hearing with a very strong interest in the Espionage Act and how it applies to Assange's case, and been working for months actually on a history of that. And I learned a great deal from the testimony of several experts about the act. What's important to understand about this is that it came about in 1917, just as the US was entering the First World War, against the wishes of a vast number of Americans who still held to what George Washington said in his farewell address, not to entangle the US in the affairs of Europe. Excuse me. And that was still believed. That was only about 110 years after Washington had said that. So there was an enormous amount of dissent against US entering that war. And that was one of the main thrusts of the Espionage Act, was to put in prison even editors at that time, and a politician, most famously Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party candidate for president, for making speeches or writing articles calling on American men to resist the draft. So there were, in fact, prosecutions and imprisonment of many editors. The Masses was a publication in New York in which several editors were jailed simply on the draft issue. But also in the Espionage Act was this passage that has survived, that comes directly from the British Official Secrets Act of 1889, which was incorporated in the 1911 US Defense Secrets Act, which then became the basis of the 1917 Espionage Act. And that's simply an unauthorized possession or dissemination of defense information. Doesn't even have to be classified. Something I learned during these hearings. Could just defense information. And that's important because the issue of informants was throughout, especially at the beginning, and a U.S. Theme in the courtroom, that Assange was not being charged for possession of unauthorized possession of classified material or defense information, but only for publishing the names of the informants. This took up an enormous amount of time in the court, and the fact is the government decided that the informants' names are defense information. Now, it was alluded to in the first panel, of course, that the informants' names were actually revealed inadvertently or on purpose, we don't know, by those two Guardian journalists in their book. And then it was then published by Pirate Bay and Cryptome before Assange published the unredacted diplomatic cables that had some informants' names that weren't redacted. We heard from numerous witnesses that Assange worked assiduously to remove the informants' names much more than the mainstream media partners he worked with. So the Espionage Act has that Section E in there. It is clearly, in most experts' views, in conflict with the US First Amendment. And that's the issue here. It is still in the act, so he can be charged under that. It's, in my view, the only technical thing they really have him on. As Kathy said in the first section, they really can't prove that he was even in that conversation with Chelsea Manning in terms of the conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. So if they can get him on this section of the Espionage Act, Section E, which says simply anybody who has unauthorized possession of classified information or defense information can be prosecuted. And that means anybody who's read a WikiLeaks document, who's emailed it to someone else, these are still classified. So you and I, Juan, can also be charged under the Espionage Act, because I have downloaded WikiLeaks documents, they're still classified. So this is the absurdity of the broadness of the Espionage Act. It had never been used against a journalist for that purpose. It had been, as I said, for journalists for encouraging Americans not to resist the draft in the First World War, but now it was finally used against a journalist. And there have been several attempts up until that time. FDR, during the war, tried to prosecute some editors at the Chicago Tribune because of information they had published that he was classified apparently about the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, but they never went that far. In the Pentagon Papers case, while the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times on the issue of prior restraint, i.e. the Justice Department could not order with an injunction to a newspaper in advance not to publish something, but that once it was published, there were dissenting opinions on the court saying that they could then be charged for under Section E, which Assange has been charged under. And Nixon, in fact, impaneled a grand jury in Boston to do that very fact. Even Senator Mike Gravel, who I worked with on a book about his days. Of course, Daniel Ellsberg gave Gravel the Pentagon Papers. He read it into the congressional record in a Senate committee hearing that Gravel called. He knew, and he told me back in 2008, that he was worried after that during that act, that legislative act, he had immunity. The Constitution gives immunity to all legislators. They could say whatever they want. They can reveal any classified information, and they cannot be charged. But once outside of a legislative act, and Mike did that, he went to Beacon Press in Boston, and that came up in the testimony as well, the Beacon Press story. The FBI raided Beacon Press. Mike had the Pentagon Papers published by this small publisher in Boston, and the FBI raided it. Nixon impaneled a grand jury to prosecute the two New York Times, Hendrik Smith and Neil Sheehan, who had worked on the Pentagon Papers publication. And it was only because, and this is what I'd like to talk to later in this segment, I think is the absolute most significant thing of many, many significant things we witnessed in these 4 weeks, is the Ellsberg case. He was on trial at that time, and they had to drop the case as a mistrial because it was learned that the Nixon's plumbers had broken into his psychiatrist's office to get his medical files. They had illegally wiretapped Ellsberg, and also they offered the directorship of the FBI to the judge. So because of this gross misconduct on the government's part, Ellsberg's case had to be thrown out. And of course, we heard all from UC Global that they have surveilled Assange, especially his privileged conversation with lawyers. They even discussed poisoning or kidnapping him. This Ellsberg was very excited when he read about this testimony because he thought this was precisely what had happened to him, and that if he got off, Julian should be able to get off. So Nixon dropped that Boston grand jury because the two journalists from the Times asked the government, well, if you wiretap Ellsberg, you probably were here listening to us because we spoke to him on the phone. So that was the end of that. And then, of course, we know, and this came up throughout the beginning of the hearing, as James Lewis tried to establish that the Obama administration never ended the grand jury. But of course, we all know that the Obama administration decided not to prosecute Assange under that section that FDR tried, that Nixon tried, that Obama tried, but decided to pull back, but Trump administration has. That's the key part here in the Espionage Act. The first prosecution of a publisher for publishing material that should be protected by the First Amendment is in conflict with the First Amendment, and if it should be challenged, hopefully as a result of the Assange case, and it could be perhaps struck out. There are members of Congress, Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna, who've worked on an amendment to the Espionage Act to carve out an exception for journalists. Who knows how far that will go? But at least there's movement in Congress to try to remedy this situation with the Espionage Act.
Yeah, it's exciting to hear about Tulsi Gabbard's new approach, and she's pronounced herself in favor of Julian and let him free. You mentioned a little bit about the idea of classified information being a criminal offense, and we know that the prosecution has been misleading the court and the witnesses into saying that it's only a few names, but really there's 16 charges that are about handling and receiving information, and this is classified information. And this is day-to-day journalism for most journalists, especially journalists that handle national security. I mean, Trevor Tim went as far as to say that every reader of a newspaper or a television program or a website could potentially be in breach of the Espionage Act if this case is successfully prosecuted. Taylor, I would like to ask you a little bit about what would happen if in this case to journalism and to all journalists if Julian Assange's case is prosecuted.
Yeah, so first, thank you for having me on here. Essentially, what would happen if Assange were to be extradited to the United States, we did hear about this in court specifically, is that he will be tried in the U.S. Eastern District Court of Virginia, which is known as the Espionage Court. And John Kiriakou was also tried in this court. He has spoken about his case quite extensively and very publicly, and said that you were not granted a fair trial in this specific court because the jury pool is essentially made up of members of the intelligence community, former members of the intelligence community, or their families. And then also, too, much of the evidence would not be able to be discussed in the court. They would use code words to signify other pieces of evidence in the case, which is inherently prejudicial to the defendant in that situation, because then perhaps the jury is thinking, how bad could this be that I cannot even hear this evidence? And so the odds would be inherently not in his favor. And in addition to this, I believe no national security defendant has ever won a case there. And what is happening in this case is that the United States is seeking to apply its jurisdiction beyond its own borders and to apply its own laws to non-US citizens. Assange is an Australian citizen, of course, not a US citizen. And also the latest interpretation in a UK court, I believe, or in one of the courts, was that the First Amendment does not apply to foreign nationals. However, the U.S. Espionage Act of 1917 does. Now, other attorneys who I've spoken with disagree with this interpretation, but that is how the situation is playing out here, is that Assange does not have First Amendment protections. And historically, it's been up to prosecutorial discretion to not use the Espionage Act against innocent citizens and against journalists and publishers. However, that is exactly what is happening here. And it's very important that there is no U.S. extradition, because I could tell you he is not going to receive a fair hearing. And also, too, we learned about the prison conditions. Assange would be held under SAMs, or special administrative measures, which would make it very difficult for him to have proper and confidential communications with his attorneys. I guess you could say that he would not even be able to speak with his attorneys confidentially. One of the witnesses he was an attorney, and he also represented individuals who were subjected to these pretrial conditions. He stated that he had to scream to his client through the metal door just to be able to hear him speak. So it's a very corrupt system, and it was really disturbing to see the prosecution try to paint the US prison system under these conditions as some sort of luxury or like it's a spa area. Just very serious misrepresentations on behalf of the prosecution. We could talk about that all day here, but it's important to know that Assange is already in a very vulnerable state. We had to hear extensive testimony about his mental health, which I think was very upsetting, and especially for his family. So for him to then be subjected to even more psychological torture in a US prison would be absolutely devastating for him. And that also highlights and speaks to the urgency of this case and the urgency that he is freed.
Thank you, Taylor. Let's go back a little bit again to the publications. It seemed, I mean, the publications highlight war crime after war crime after war crime, corruption. I mean, to the point that the diplomats at the UN were asked to get Ban Ki-moon's DNA. I mean, there's all types of crazy conduct that the US has been doing, and that was exposed by WikiLeaks, especially the murders and gruesome murders of thousands and thousands of people. Yet it is the journalist who is in jail, not the people who perpetrated these crimes. And I want to go to Richard to ask him a little bit, to elaborate a little bit on about this. But once Assange is prosecuted, what will other journalists, what will happen if the New York Times gets a scoop the size of the WikiLeaks scoop? Will they publish?
Hi, so thanks for having me on the panel. It's really an honor to be here, and among other journalists, you know, we're few, but we're the only ones who covered this hearing and did our due diligence and duty to protecting freedom of press. So I'm really honored to be among you guys. And when it comes to the impact this is going to have on journalists, I mean, I think the very fact that this hearing is taking place is indicative of how much a threat national security journalism poses in the mind of the ruling elites. And, you know, as Noam Chomsky eloquently put it in his witness statement that was submitted to the court on day 17, this is not the publications that Julian Assange put out with WikiLeaks. They're not actually pertinent to national security. They're pertinent to the security of the ruling elites. They're pertinent to the security of the presidents, the leaders, the military-industrial complex, the national security blob, who are undertaking these war crimes and would like to keep that as secret as possible and out of the public sphere. So they're actually threatened by this. It's not because it's actually a matter of national security or because it actually puts anyone at harm. I mean, even when it comes to this this myth that they're perpetuating inside of the courtroom, that WikiLeaks allegedly harmed the names of, or rather harmed alleged informants by unredacted cables. I mean, first of all, we know for a fact there was an exhaustive redaction process, as people who worked on these leaks testified in court. And they were trying to make it out to be as though Julian Assange is some callous guy out looking for fame, and he just dumped all these leaks. This is a lie. We know for a fact there was a very extensive, exhaustive redaction process. And moreover, the DOD, by their own admission, they could not find a single example of someone actually being harmed by the WikiLeaks publication. And the whole notion that we would outweigh the suffering of these countless victims. I mean, Chelsea Manning uncovered 15,000 dead Iraqis, thanks Iraq body count, thanks to her leaks, uncovered that, which is akin to finding a mass grave. Never mind the million Iraqis that died as a whole in the war that was started in 2003. And we're just glossing over that. They're glossing over that in the courtroom and acting as if imaginary informants that they cannot name have more value than the people hurt and killed and tortured in these war crimes. And even Khaled al-Masri, I mean, the fact that his torture was proven as a fact. I mean, he got a ruling from the European Court of Human Rights. They paid him compensation. They held Macedonia accountable for this and named the CIA as perpetrators inside of the court decision. So we know for a fact that this happened thanks to WikiLeaks. And nonetheless, it's being the judge tried to omit this from the court, tried to stop the defense from submitting it into the record, and then he was unable to testify, and it's because there were video link issues. And then she immediately did not give him a chance to even try another way to reach the court, and just dismissed it. I mean, this is so dehumanizing and disgusting to treat a torture victim like that, because you can imagine that it's very, very hurtful to bring up these memories again and come and actually be brave enough to testify in the court about that again after having already done that. You know, that takes a lot of guts, and it must be really upsetting. And he tried nonetheless, and he was just dismissed. And so journalists, what national security journalism does, what WikiLeaks did, and what Julian Assange is on trial for, is really because it poses a threat to the ruling elites and the people who are starting these endless wars. And I think it's really disgusting how a lot of journalists and media news outlets have actually adopted things that WikiLeaks pioneered or helped pioneer, such as a secure drop system. And now they've left WikiLeaks and Assange holding the bag, and they won't actually open their mouths or come in defense of Assange, even though they also publish issues pertaining to national security. If they get their hands on a scoop, and that they did publish a lot of these things in tandem with WikiLeaks at first, but I mean, now they're nowhere to be found. They're nowhere to be seen. I mean, I was outside the court. I walked out on the last day. There's not a single person from mainstream media there, save for perhaps Rupley and RT and you know, there's no CNN, there's no Channel 4, there's no BBC, none of them anywhere to be found, and definitely not The Guardian. And, you know, I think it's very indicative since the beginning, because even the day after Cryptome published the leaks, and again, there's nothing wrong with that, but nonetheless, immediately the Guardian went into full action and condemned WikiLeaks along with Le Monde and Die Presse to try and you know, shift all of the blame onto Assange, as if he did not undertake an exhaustive redaction process, as if he was just some careless journalist, and they had no part in this. I think that was really abhorrent and abysmal behavior, and they've carried that out onto this day. And I really think that this is the true reason they're going after Assange. They're going after WikiLeaks because the nature of the things he exposed, these war crimes, are so grave. I mean, just the one that you mentioned earlier, Juan, about the house that was leveled with an airstrike after they executed an entire family in cold blood. I mean, this is really what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with people who are behaving like Nazis. And this is unacceptable. They're committing genocide in plain sight and trying to normalize this. And Daniel Ellsberg in his statement talked about how they didn't even have the same classification that as the things that he was working on with the Pentagon Papers. They become normalized now to with war crimes. There's a desensitization that we won't even bother classifying these as top secret. It's just, they're just basic field reports now. And, you know, I just want to draw the attention to the Overseas Operations Bill, which had its second reading now in the Parliament in the UK, where they're trying to legalize war crimes, essentially, and implement a statute of limitation of 5 years. And my point here is that even if someone is found guilty of having, or rather been caught committing war crimes, because we've seen, for example, with the Sunday Times and BBC publishing these emails from Helmand province in Afghanistan, where they were also executing people in cold blood. They were saying things like, oh, we found these Afghan men who brandished a weapon or a grenade all of a sudden, and they found more bodies than weapons. So, I mean, this doesn't even add up mathematically. And we know this went all the way from Afghanistan, from Helmand province, to the Ministry of Defense in the UK. And not a single person was found guilty. Not a single person in the entire chain of command. And, you know, when we talk about Musa, for example, Baha Musa, who was literally beaten to death by British forces in Iraq, a 26-year-old Iraqi man. The corporal who did this, he received 1 year in jail, and then he was court-martialed, sentenced to a year in jail, and then let out. So no one is going to be held accountable for these war crimes, even when we have clear-cut evidence of them committing murder. And it's absolutely disgusting that the only person on trial here is Julian Assange. The only organization on trial here is WikiLeaks. The only thing that's on trial here is real journalism that actually holds power accountable, that holds these governments accountable. And, you know, I recall very distinctly how a UK High Court in 2017 blocked a prosecution against Tony Blair, who helped start the Iraq War with George Bush, and their lies about these 45 minutes, you know, the UK is 45 minutes away from an attack by Saddam Hussein, and all these disgusting lies day in, day out. I remember watching it every single day, brainwashing us with these lies about weapons of mass destruction. And so when you have someone who's juxtaposing that, who's coming who's diametrically opposed to the propaganda, to the lies, and who is bringing all of this into the light, and it evaporates their power, as Noam Chomsky eloquently put it. And that's exactly why they're going after Julian Assange. And unfortunately, I don't think that these mainstream outlets, they care to even pursue this kind of level of journalism. As we saw this BBC Home Affairs correspondent saying that it was a repetitive hearing, like he couldn't even be bothered to come and watch it. I mean, this is really disgusting. And this is going to have grave ramifications for people doing real journalism if it actually goes ahead and he's extradited, you know, God forbid.
I mean, that's exactly right. This will not stop with Julian Assange. And we saw people like Trevor Tim warning about this. This is the end of the First Amendment. And because of the United States push to impose its own laws into other countries, they're basically colonizing other countries and making journalism of the best kind, the journalism that holds power into account, illegal. Right. But I want to move on to another topic, because we don't have as many hours as I would love to have to discuss this case, to the espionage that was the UC Global case and espionage on Assange. And I want to start with saying that, well, I found out about the case when El País wrote about it, but I was in the embassy since, you know, visiting Julian Assange and filming them since 2012. And it was obvious to everybody that at the very least, the intelligence agencies in the UK would have been monitoring the internet, and they would have been doing espionage. And I had learned about these laser microphones that now we know were put in place way back. So, I mean, and this whole thing was, we know that the embassy was the most surveilled place in the world. But what I found very interesting was in last year, in 2018, Stefania Marizzi published an article where she actually named me, and I was surprised. And I want to read you a little extracts of that document, which is an email from David Morales, the owner of UC Global, to his men on the ground. He was supposed, UC Global is the company that was hired by Ecuador to protect Assange, who started working with the American intelligence through Las Vegas Sands, owned by Sheldon Adelson. So this is what he writes. Let's be very careful with the information that we transmit, and careful with how the information is handled. SENAIN, which is the Ecuadorian intelligence service, is investigating us. That is why I would like my location to be, whenever possible, restricted, especially my trips to the USA. I'm going to need you to work on the following: Wi-Fi data of the embassy, if we have the password or whatever. I need to see the composition of the walls that surround the room of the guest, brick, masonry, cement. Also, if it were possible, photos of the interior, failing that we know what furniture the embassy has, the telephone list of the embassy, videos or photos of the room and equipment in the room of the video recorder. In particular, the following profile must be raised and updated: personal data, relationship with the guest, telephones, emails, numbers of visits, etc. of these regular visitors or guests. And there's a number of people, including myself, in there. And then special attention to Stella Morris. We may need a person wholly dedicated to her, and they mention also her family. So with that said, we also heard in evidence in courts that they were paying special attention to the privileged conversations with his lawyers, and that they had even bugged the bathrooms where Julian Assange held his private conversation. So Joe, would you like to start this discussion?
Yes, thank you, Juan. First, I want to just say I second everything that Richard said. Those were brilliant points about why they're going after Julian. He also brought up, Richard, I think the testimony from Ellsberg when he talked about the normalization of this type of behavior, like the killing of those people in Afghanistan, that it was put in low-level reports that someone with a very low security clearance like Chelsea Manning could get access to. While back in the Vietnam War, that would have been top secret. So the US then understood that if you had an assassination program or if you had a torture program, you would put it top secret, not let it go around for 1 million people. We understood now to happen. Why do I say all that? Is because this misconduct, this government misconduct, this operation from a US intelligence agency, we don't know exactly which one. Witness one, I believe, said that he asked Morales when he asked him who are the American friends, and Morales said US intelligence. The witness asked him specifically which, and he cut him off. So whatever US intelligence agency it was, and it probably was the CIA, it could have been the NSA, they had the capabilities. They used this casino in Las Vegas to launder this operation. It was the front operation. So what they've got on Assange here, especially with the lawyers, is so egregiously illegal. And if it comes out, and if the case in Spain ends before January 4th, the day, Judgment Day, that means that would validate, if there's a conviction of Morales, validate these witness one and witness two's testimony. But even if they don't, there's if you take it on its face, the testimony from these two former associates of Morales, one an IT employee and the other a former partner of Morales, 50-50 partner, then the US engaged in a massive misconduct against Julian Assange, but even worse than what the government did to Ellsberg. And they spied on him, especially the lawyers. They tried to get the DNA from the diaper of the baby to see the paternity if it was Assange. They discussed killing him. This should lead Baraitser to throw this case out. There are two things that she could throw. She could just deny extradition, and it would be this one, and the health issue. His health problems could not withstand the conditions of the American prisons, as we heard. Those would avoid all the sticky political issues about espionage, etc. So that's the hope that we have, I think, if we want to see Assange not extradited, is based on those two matters. So that was for me, the most profound and important of all the testimony we heard, what we heard from those two anonymous witnesses. I don't think it was a mistake that the defense team left it to the end as a dramatic close to a brilliantly presented case. I think they understood the entire narrative we have here, all the issues involved, and they very comprehensively covered every base in the witnesses they brought to lay out the story of what really happened with Julian Assange here. Unfortunately, we heard the word irrelevant mentioned by Mary Kostakidis in the first section. Well, who says it's irrelevant? The courts, the James Lewis, prosecutor for the US government, said all this information, which they didn't challenge as evidence. They allowed it to go in, obviously. He said it was irrelevant. That they spied on Assange in the way that they did, that they talked about killing him, is irrelevant. Now, Gordon Kromberg, the invisible man, in this 4 weeks, who was mentioned virtually every day, probably every day, by the prosecution, he did not show up in the court to sit there in the stand or to be on video link, which he could easily have been from Alexandria, Virginia, to be challenged by the defense. And yet his name and his affidavit and his statements were invoked every day by the prosecution. And in one of them, he actually admits, in a way, backhandedly, that they did spy. The US government has spied on Assange, but none of that was collected. Anything that was collected on Assange was used in the indictment or will be used in the prosecution of him in a trial if there is one. Now, think about that. He's saying that, okay, we did all that. This is the government that's prosecuting him. An intelligence agency of that government eavesdropped on the defense preparations for the very trial and extradition hearing and the trial allowed. There's no way that they could get away with that. And yet he's saying, Lewis, it's irrelevant because Kromberg says we're not using it. And we underlying this entire hearing one from the government side was, trust us, we're the government is telling the truth. Kromberg says there is no solitary confinement in the Alexandria Detention Center. And then we had lawyers who went in every day, or often to see clients there, and described solitary confinement. As was mentioned before, they had to shout through the steel door if the food slot was not open to get down and speak to their client. So the government's lying here, but they're the ones who determine what's relevant or not. They have normalized this type of spying, this type of criminal behavior that 50 years ago got Ellsberg's case thrown out, that 50 years ago an incident like what happened in Afghanistan happened in Vietnam, the My Lai massacre. And the result of the My Lai massacre was that a whistleblower went to Congress, and then to a journalist, Cy Hirsch, who wrote about it. They actually prosecuted at least one soldier in that massacre in Vietnam. So the whistleblower in that case went to Congress and nothing happened to him. The whistleblower in the collateral murder video, Chelsea Manning, went to jail. The journalist got a Pulitzer Prize and a job at the New York Times. This journalist who broke that went to jail, Julian Assange. And no one was prosecuted for the collateral murder video. And there was someone prosecuted for My Lai. Why? I compared the two to show in 50 years how things have changed. And this is very depressing, that we were in a situation where an entire post-war period of the United States, of the invasions, the coups, the war crimes that have been committed, are covered up routinely by the mainstream media by portraying it as spreading democracy. And here comes along a guy almost single-handedly and rips that cover apart and shows what the real behavior and the face of the United States is. And he's in the dock at the Old Bailey. So I think that the UC Global thing is really the most important evidence of all the great evidence the defense put on, because it should have this case thrown out. And if it isn't by Baraitser, then all of our fears about her will come true. But I also hold out hope that she might actually act like a judge here.
Yeah, I've heard Stella Morris say that when she had to say important information to him, including when she was pregnant, she had to write it down on paper. This was the same. I heard the same thing from Kristen Hrafson, who heard an entire conversation in the meeting room they had about politics and whatever. And when they had to do serious business, they actually did not get anything because Julian Assange and the team were already kind of prepared for audio monitoring. What's your view on this, Taylor, and how could it affect the case?
Yeah, so I agree with Joe. It's either the revelations that came out about UC Global spying, or it is going to be Assange's mental health and his treatment that is essentially going to cause the judge to make the right decision and prevent U.S. extradition. But I think the key here is UC Global spying. I mean, this is extremely serious. It is sufficient enough to throw the case out of court, of course, because all of Assange's or many of his communications with his attorneys has essentially been revealed to his prosecutors and persecutors back in the United States and those in the U.S. intelligence community. But essentially, what happened in the embassy, and I know you were, of course, spent a lot of time there, was once there was a change in government in Ecuador, once Rafael Correa was no longer president, and then we had Lenin Moreno, who became president, I think, in 2017, things started to change in the embassy. And this was because, of course, Lenin Moreno was very much willing to work with the United States and was more right-leaning in his politics. However, I don't think that he was very upfront about that prior to his becoming president. But that is essentially what caused this change. And it was all designed to get Assange and provoke him to leave the embassy on his own. But of course, that did not happen. And you see this sort of backdoor deal play out where the British police are then invited into the Ecuadorian embassy. And I remember when I learned about this I remember it very clearly on Thursday morning on April 11th of 2019. I initially thought it was an act of war and that the British police just went into the embassy, but they were, of course, invited in, which shows and suggests, of course, that there was some discussion there of how this was exactly going to play out. And then John Kiriakou also made the very interesting point that they tend to arrest people on Thursdays to break them down over the weekend in order to get them to speak once they go to court or to just mentally tear them down. But also, too, Assange's time in the embassy is it's important to talk about the torture that he was subjected to. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, of course, said that while he was in the embassy, while Assange was in the embassy, that he was subjected to torture, and 4 governments are complicit in this. That is the US, UK, Sweden, and Ecuador. And much of this is rooted in the smear campaign against Assange and the falsehoods that have been stated about him and his activities in the embassy. This has been repeatedly shot down by Fidel Narvaez, who is the former Ecuadorian consul who spent time in the embassy as well, and said that everything that you're hearing about him in the mainstream press is absolutely false. So it's important to highlight that as well. But I think that the UK has in no way appropriately handled the reports of torture. I believe that they are supposed to conduct an independent investigation into allegations of torture. They have yet to do so. And that brings me back to my other point that I made before, was that it's either UC Global spying or it's going to be Assange's mental health conditions that are going to prevent this extradition. And along with everybody else, I really, really hope the judge is going to see this for what it is and make the right decision here. I stated before that no reasonable judge could possibly grant extradition given the information that came out by the defense. There's no way. And given the fact that the prosecution has failed to make its case and put up a horrible prosecution, essentially. So the judge, though, has some conflicts of interest. Not for Raitzer specifically, we don't know much about her, but it's important to talk about Matt Kenner's work with Declassified UK. He and Mark Curtis have done a fantastic job exposing the former judge, Lady Arbuthnot, and her husband and son's ties to the UK military and intelligence establishment.
Very rudely, darling, but I want to go to that point just after.
Gotcha.
So maybe let's save that for a little bit. We're going to go over about 10 minutes. So we have about 20 minutes to go. My final question is going to be on fair trial here and there. But I want to give Richard a go at the UC Global stuff. Just before, I want to mention when you said that in the Lenin Moreno administration came to power, things changed. Yeah, they did massively, to the point that I had to stop bringing in my regular phone in, which was something that we were allowed usually to have in. Then we were taking that privilege away. I had to update, give them my new passport, which they later leaked. So you can actually see my passport online. I had to buy a burner phone because they were opening the telephones and getting the IMEI numbers and that type of stuff and contacts. So I had no contacts on that phone, and it was just a phone I could use if I had a paper with phone numbers written down if I had to call somebody afterwards, so it got that bad. But Richard, your view on UC Global, considering the time as well, we don't have a massive amount of time, but I want to give you your fair share.
Yeah, so what happened with UC Global with this spying on the embassy, I mean, it's unbelievably grave. I mean, my parents were diplomats. They worked as United Nations peacekeepers. So I really understand the gravity of this. The United Kingdom has a duty as a host country to protect every single diplomatic mission on their country, right, in their land. So what they've done here is a gross violation of Ecuador's sovereignty. They've allowed the United States to essentially use the embassy as a playground, to use the capital of the United Kingdom as a playground to undertake this spying operation. I mean, I really can't overstate how much of a disgusting violation this is of international law, of the UK's own laws. They just don't care. I mean, they've essentially handed it over, as I said, like a playground to the United States to do whatever they will. And I was in court with Fidel, and it was brought up during the proceedings how Assange, his diplomatic passport, his citizenship were revoked. I talked with Fidel about that, and because there was a plan at one moment to maybe get Assange out using a diplomatic passport, because if you have diplomatic plates or a passport, they can't stop you. Although we saw with Evo Morales, the Bolivian president, that didn't stop them from grounding his plane, which again, the levels to which the US can reach inside of other countries, Western European allies, and do these things is insane. So equally here in this case, the United Kingdom essentially just refused to register him as a diplomat, even though it's highly political decision, and again a violation of international treaties. And so that plan was not, in the end, it was not undertaken, and it was abandoned. And the violations, as I've mentioned countless times in this case, no matter how you look at it, are staggering. I mean, the fact they spied on him and put this microphone in the ladies' room to listen to his conversations with his legal team and violate his legal privilege. I mean, this is a gross violation of Article 8 under the European Convention on Human Rights. It's a gross violation of British common law. It's a gross violation of US right to due process. I mean, there's no way you can look at this and justify this. Any judge with a shred of integrity would throw this out on day one. It's just not feasible. You can't proceed with a court case, never mind an extradition, using tainted evidence, knowing that once this person, the defendant, is going to get to the US, they're going to be prosecuted and subjected to an unfair trial, which that in of itself is a violation of Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So you know that the United States is going to use this tainted evidence against him, the things they collected with the spying, listening to his legal counsel, and this guarantee, this quote unquote guarantee that we've been given by AUSA Kronberg and the prosecution that they won't do it, and we're supposed to take their word for it. This is absurd. I mean, they're literally talking about plotting to, considering to murder him and make it look like an accident. I mean, do these really look like the most convincing characters? Not really. I don't think, you could trust them an inch. So that's absurd to even proceed with this entire hearing. And when it comes to his mental health, I think it's, under Section 91 of the Extradition Act, you can argue that extradition would be harmful because it would cause, grave peril and detriment to the physical or mental health of the defendant. And that's how actually Gary McKinnon's case was withdrawn under the Human Rights Act, thanks to Theresa May, which is perhaps the only good thing she's ever done in her career. But so it was a necessary evil for the defense to bring up Assange's medical records in the court in order to block the extradition. However, it was quite dehumanizing to have the prosecution trying to play doctor, and you had Lewis essentially berating the top neuropsychiatrist in the country, Koppelman and other expert testimonies from neuropsychiatrists and doctors, Dr. Crosby as well, and trying to tell them that they're not experts, even though he's used Koppelman himself. He's solicited his services in other cases, which he mentioned in the proceedings. And I think that was really dehumanizing because they're trying to move the goalposts. So it's like, okay, maybe the defendant has depression, but it's a mild depression. And they tried to make this point that you must have psychosis in order for this to be considered serious mental illness. Depression is a serious mental illness. There's an epidemic of male suicides. Hundreds of men kill themselves every day. So to suggest that depression is not a serious mental illness is really dehumanizing and insulting, not to mention the fact that they're lying about the conditions under which Assange is already in and will be placed under, these harsh SAMs, which will most definitely worsen his condition. So I think the spying, the lying, the constant moving and shifting of goalposts, it's really a tainted court case from top to bottom. And there's no way any judge could move forward with this. And I really hope she does rule against this extradition hearing, although I'm keeping my hopes up in general, but not specifically for this. Remember, Gary McKinnon, his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they still ruled that he has to be extradited. And then somehow, by a miracle, at the last minute, Theresa May withdrew the extradition request. So who knows what will happen? But I'm keeping my hopes up, of course, for Assange.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have hopes. Mary Kostakidis said that she was very hopeful. I personally, I feel like I have hope, but my intellect and my knowledge, especially through WikiLeaks revelations, tells me that the power and reach that the United States has goes beyond the independence that the judiciary has. And we have to remember that Vanessa Breitzer is junior magistrate. So for her to be returning any type of interesting verdict is actually would be maybe even detrimental for her career. So we're looking at it. I think it's important to look at it that way. And this brings us up to the judge that's overseeing the case, which is Lady Arbuthnot. And I think Taylor had some important things to say about that.
Yes, so it was, again, Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis with Declassified UK, who has done a series of investigations into the judge. They just put out a new investigation. I'll touch on it just briefly here, about one of the prosecution witnesses. I believe it was Dr. Nigel Blackwood. He works for the Institute of Psychiatry, which is funded by the UK military. And there are some close ties with, obviously, a UK establishment there. And again, this was one of the prosecution's witnesses. I haven't had a chance to read the full piece, but it will be interesting to look into the details of their revelations in that piece. But prior to this most recent publication or article that they put forward is a series of investigations into Lady Arbuthnot. As you said, Juan, she has previously heard this case, made some pretty important decisions in this case. She has yet to formally recuse herself. Right now, she did step down. She is overseeing the judges in her jurisdiction, which includes Judge Vanessa Baratzer. And again, not much is known about her because the UK government refused to release Declassified UK any information on her, but they were able to establish that she has, I guess you would say, a 96% rate of granting extradition. So 96% of the time she has granted extradition in cases. And again, that is the judge that is currently here in this case. Lady Arbuthnot herself has had very close ties, especially through her husband and her son, to UK military establishment, UK intelligence, as well as the US intelligence and military establishment. And her husband, I believe, was actually implicated in WikiLeaks documents, and her son is very high up in an anti-data leaking company, which clearly conflicts with the ideology and values of WikiLeaks and those of Julian Assange. So clear conflicts of interest there. And as I said before, she is required to formally recuse herself on this case. She has yet to do so. So her previous rulings in the case still stand. If she did recuse herself, they could be revisited. So I just wanted to point out their important work with that. And again, to one of you mentioned on the stream here that there could possibly be career repercussions for Baratzer if she were to not grant US extradition. That's important to keep in mind. I'm sure that she'll have career opportunities, unfortunately, if she were to grant extradition. That's really just speculative at this point. It's just based off of what we know so far. But those are the clear conflicts of interest in the case. I'm sure there are more that have yet to be revealed. But again, that does speak to the question of, is he receiving a fair hearing? And I would have to say, no, he is not, just because of these very close ties to the people who are prosecuting Assange.
Thank you, Taylor. Richard, quickly, your thoughts on, can he get a fair hearing here and in the US?
Absolutely not. I mean, to even entertain or contemplate this notion is farcical, unfortunately, because once again, this is lifting the veil off of the face of imperialism. It's really exposing the war machine for what it is, not just with the US, but also with their quote unquote allies. They call them allies, but they're actually just being bullied around. You know, the UK, as we saw also with the US, with Germany and Italy, how they were more than willing to bend over backwards and serve the United States and not prosecute and not go after these CIA agents and people involved in torture programs. And it's like they don't even have enough respect for their own sovereignty to defend themselves in the face of the United States. And never mind the fact that you have people's human rights, their very lives being extinguished. And so I don't think that people who go against imperialism in the way that WikiLeaks has done, in the way that Julian Assange has done, who really expose the true face of what it means to invade other countries and subject millions of people to displacement, to torture, to killings, to genocide, essentially, these people are never treated fairly. And I don't think he's getting a fair trial in the UK by any stretch of the imagination. I literally was in the court. You all watched that with me too, and you know what's going on in there, and it's an abomination, to say the least. I mean, whatever semblance of justice that the UK professed to have, because as we know, for hundreds of years, the UK went around the world colonizing people, pretending to be better and more civilized. Well, that's clearly been exposed once again to be a myth. And the United States, which also professes itself to be some kind of beacon of democracy, also has no interest in applying even its own laws, because this absurd notion that Julian Assange has to be prosecuted under US law, yet he has no benefits or rights under US law. I mean, this is the mental gymnastics of the highest order. You know, Mike Pompeo himself is just coming out and blatantly saying that, yeah, Julian Assange has no First Amendment rights. He's all the way in an embassy in London. This is back in 2017. Well, okay, if he's all the way in an embassy in London, or he's all the way in London, then clearly he's not subjected to any US law, never mind US. So, I mean, this is a clear intent of undertaking a political witch hunt. And he's not getting a fair trial here because this courtroom is being run by the United States. The fact this is even happening, that the judge accepted a superseding indictment past the deadline and is not even giving the basic legal fundamental rights to the defendant, and rushing through the case in order to get witness statements done so quickly that they have to be done by written form instead of actually having people testify. I mean, this is absurd, and there's a clear indication of favoritism here. So that's not conjecture or speculation. That's literally what just happened, and we all saw that. So to suggest that he would get a fair trial in the UK, no way. Unfortunately, I don't think that he's being afforded any protections or rights that he is owed. Remember, once again, he's an Australian citizen and he's in the United Kingdom. He's not subject to US law. He didn't commit a crime in the US. He doesn't owe the US a single thing. And they're trying to drag him all the way from the UK across the Atlantic and put him in a supermax prison because he exposed what imperialism is. And they were no way going to give him a fair trial. It's just not happening.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on this superseding indictment. He didn't see his lawyers for 6 months. A few days after, there was no way to put more evidence into this case. The US took away the extradition treaty and put in a new one in order to create a superseding indictment possible. Right. But the proceeding kept on going. It didn't stop and restart. And Julian Assange was not able to read the indictment until a night before the process started. So, Joe, quickly, we have about 4 minutes. Your thoughts on the fairness of the hearings here and in the United States?
Look, it's not uncommon, even in the United States, for the mafia to kill a journalist when he's about to reveal their crimes. This is basically how the US government is operating. He revealed their crimes and they want to destroy him. The problem is the public sees the mafia as a criminal organization. They do not see the US government as a criminal organization. They are legitimized over and over again by the media, by the corporate media, as being some organization to actually trust. And that was, again, a theme throughout the entire hearing, that people in government don't have self-interests. They don't have career ambitions like people in the private sector. Of course they do. They're not there as selfless public servants as they portray themselves. They are protecting their own butts because he revealed war crimes, and the individuals, we know who they were in the Bush administration. We know who they were in the Obama administration. So clearly this is like a mob operation, a hit operation to take out a journalist, which happens routinely all the time. And that is what we're faced here. The public trusts the government, the corporate media ensures that they trust government. They portray government as having the public's interest in mind, not their own individual career interest, as if anyone else does in the private sector. I just want to say one thing about Richard. I agree with everything he said, except one point, which is, unfortunately, the US does have jurisdiction over Assange in the Espionage Act, even though he's an Australian, even though he never operated in the US. And this came about in a 1961 amendment to the Espionage Act, and we began by speaking about the Espionage Act. There was an incident of a US diplomat at the embassy in Warsaw in 1959, and he was found in bed with a woman who was not his wife, and the Polish Secret Service burst in and photographed him. So with these pictures, they blackmailed him and said, you give us these documents, these classified materials, or this is in the newspaper and your life is ruined, in the days when adultery, of course, was seen far more harshly than it might be today. So he went into the US Embassy and he got you these classified documents and he gave them which was US territory, and he went on to Polish territory and gave it to the secret services of Poland. He got found out, he was arrested, and a congressman discovered that he could not be charged under the Espionage Act because until that moment, it only covered US territory or the high seas. So he had to be charged under another act, the McCarran Act, but he could not be charged under the Espionage Act. And this congressman got crazy about this. His name was Puff, Richard Puff, I believe, and he got 3 votes, and he was able to put an amendment and change the Espionage Act so that it covers the entire world. Anywhere in the world, anyone who possesses and disseminates classified information, not being authorized to do so, can be charged under the Espionage Act. So because of that 61 case and that amendment, they can get Assange. There is universal jurisdiction in the Espionage Act. The issue is whether there's dual criminality, whether there are similar statutes in the Official Secrets Act of Britain. We heard Baraitser asking for the 1989 Act. 1989 was the last time it was revised. That's the current Official Secrets Act in Britain. She has to look at both the Espionage Act and the Official Secrets Act, as well as the Computer Intrusion Act in the US and whatever legislation acts in Britain, to see if what the US alleges he committed is also a crime in Britain. So we hope that she does the right thing. And frankly, I still hold out hope, because there have been several brave people in this whole story, starting with Chelsea Manning, of course, and Julian Assange himself, but also those 2 UC Global employees who've spoken out. And there's still a chance, at least in the High Court, maybe if not Baraitser, that someone will look at this open case of injustice and decide he cannot be extradited, health reasons or because of the UC Global misconduct of the US government. It's very easy to make that decision. Legally, politically, it may be very difficult for Baraitser. Her career interests absolutely are important. But as you go higher up, judges have nowhere further to go in their careers, and they have more latitude to make the right decision. And that's what my hope is, that on appeal, this very obvious case in favor of Assange will actually be adjudicated that way.
Thank you all. I would like to just finish up by saying that this is, I agree with Meltzer's view that this is not a judicial case. This is obviously a political case. And the UK-US extradition treaty does not allow for political extraditions. And I don't think that you can get more political than espionage as a political charge. So we just hope that the UK judicial system sees that, but we have to fight ourselves, and we have to make our voices known. And I think the more people that join the campaigns in different parts of the world to make their voices heard, this is how we're going to win. Especially in the UK. This is the most important jurisdiction for press freedom in the world right now. So if you're in the UK, you should join the Assange campaign. Go to Don't Extradite Assange. Follow these amazing journalists that are in this panel today, and we'll keep on pushing every bit of information we can to the public so that we can continue to have our right to speak and the right for us to know what our governments do in our name. Thank you very much, guys. And it was a pleasure sharing a panel with you.
Thank you.